everyone. You're listening to one of our first episodes for Angelneers, a community of startup builders based in Silicon Valley, where experienced operators share their knowledge on how to build and scale startup companies that will create an impact and provide long-lasting value along the way. I'm your host, Oleg Kujikov, and today our guest is Igor Plotnikov, who brings 30 years of business experience in developing technology products. Two of the startups that he's founded were acquired by F5 Networks and Cisco. But before we get into that, Igor, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. So how about to get started, you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, obviously, I'm originally from Russia. You can tell by my accent and by my name. Educated in Moscow as a physicist. My postgraduate studies were in the field of astronomical image processing, basically enhancing pictures taken by the large ground-based telescopes. And this naturally sucked me into doing modeling and image processing on computers. And I ended up being a part of this computer revolution that, still going on strong. So started a little startup in Russia with colleagues doing the same, image processing, but this time for desktop publishing. And this essentially ended up being my resume when I came to the US in '92, where I joined work on IP-based video conferencing.
Mhm.
And we got bought by a nice little company called Netscape Communications.
I think I've heard of them, yeah.
Right. It's actually amazing how many people these days don't know what it is, what it was. And it was a great company that really started the internet.
Well, I'm being a little facetious. Of course, I know Netscape, but for the listeners that might not, do you want to tell us like what the big deal was about that?
Well, Netscape was the
ahead.
company that commercialized the browser. It was the company founded by Mark Andreessen, who is best known now as part of Andreessen Horowitz VC company, and Jim
Mhm.
Clark. And Jim Clark is, a billionaire who founded a company called SGI, Silicon Graphics, that Hollywood ran on in the 80s and 90s. Then he co-founded Netscape, and then he went on to co-found another big company in the healthcare space, basically very, very well-known guy. So they started the company that commercialized the browser, and essentially they started the internet revolution.
Mhm.
That's I usually tell people who don't know, they used to be Google before Google became Google. They were the coolest company in the world.
We're so used to like Chrome and Firefox. I don't know what the trendy people are doing nowadays or
Right,
using for their
right.
browsers, but this was kind of like the first browser.
Right. It first started with a browser called Mosaic, written by Mark Andreessen, and then Netscape commercialized Netscape Navigator, and that was it.
Mhm.
That was the thing to use back then, in those days.
So let's get back to you. Can we hear a little bit more about getting acquired and what that was like?
That was a mixed bag in a sense, because we had a great product. Essentially, today you use Hangouts, you use Zoom, and what we were doing was a very, very early version of that. Netscape bought us and trimmed down the product, made it a part of the Netscape Communicator suite. This was all fine and dandy. That was exciting. And then I switched to working on the media streaming, audio streaming. And Netscape
Mhm.
decided that they don't want to compete in this space, and
Mhm.
essentially they canned the product. After which I quit. So the lesson to me was the acquisition didn't really go all that well, and I swore to myself that never ever again will I let an M&A process go sideways, and I think I did well on that with my other startups.
So I want to talk about hiring, but before we do that, can you tell us like what your role was, maybe your title, when you were working before leaving the company?
Well, I was a technical lead on the media server project.
Mhm. So let's talk about hiring. What are some of the challenges you faced in hiring?
Back at Netscape or overall in my career?
Well, I guess take me through it. Like, did it change before Netscape and after? Did you participate at in both of those instances,
Well,
before and after
I was
getting
not an
acquired?
executive at Netscape and before, so that challenge really presented itself, later on. I think the biggest challenge in hiring is to find the right guy, the right girl.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I want to take it back to the startup days when it was like smaller teams. Can you tell me about hiring back then?
Well, I hired through my personal network. I hired people I knew, friends, relatives. I actually opened an office in Siberia, and my cousin was the point guy there. So he harvested the local talent, which was actually pretty good talent. So that was the stick. So we did offshoring, even back in the old days.
Before today.
Yes.
How did that go? I mean, they say you should never, be roommates with your friends, but how about hiring?
Well, one of my current business partners is my old friend whom we were roommates with, and I actually hired him for that first startup of mine, and we've been working together ever since. So for me, it worked out very, very well. However, that said, people do fall out. It's like, almost like a marriage. You go into a startup, you you are in a very intense and very, very personal relationship with the key people.
Mm-hmm. It's really hard to know beforehand whether or not you're going to work well with someone. Have you noticed any patterns when it comes to hiring, as far as what makes a candidate great in the end versus just good?
It boils down to several things. First thing is the smarts. You want to hire a smart person because
Mm-hmm.
individual productivity in almost all aspects of professional life, and specifically in engineering and science, because part of what we do here in Silicon Valley is science as well. It's
Mm-hmm.
the individual productivity varies by the factor of 20. When I was an executive
What do you mean by that?
when I was an executive at Cisco, I had enough people reporting to me so that I could run a little bit of statistics, and I
Mm-hmm.
measured productivity in simple terms, like how many lines of code programmers produce, how many lines of documentation they produce, how many bugs they fix, and what I've discovered, uh, all of those parameters correlate very, very strongly. And if you look at the strongest guy, the top producer, the smartest guy, and to the most mediocre one, you will have a differential of 20 to 1. And guess
Mm-hmm.
what? Nobody, is paid 20 times more than the other guy, which tells you that it's always better for you to find the right guy, top producer, pay him well. It's going to be better than hiring 10 mediocre guys. So I think this is the challenge. This is the first challenge. You need to find the right guy in terms of the skills and abilities. Second aspect is, this person has to be conscientious, hardworking, dedicated, responsible, all those things. Because some talented people can't hold it. They
Mm-hmm.
do not have a staying power, and you do need a staying power. And lastly, there is a personal side to it. You want to have a pleasant relationship, so you
Mm-hmm.
don't want to be sharing an office or a team with an angry person.
I think I've heard this as like the airport rule. You want to hire someone that you can imagine that you could spend 24 hours in an airport with, just you and them.
That's right.
Because if you can't
That's right.
spend more than 24 hours with someone, how are you going to work
That's
with them
right.
long term?
That's right. And also, I would say that the context in a startup is somewhat contentious. You expect people to
Mm,
argue. You want them to argue, but you want them
yeah.
to be happy while they argue. You want them to argue and then go have a beer afterwards.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I currently work at a startup. I use the term hey a lot. It's healthy adult yelling. So if you're not doing a lot of hey, you're probably comfortable and you're probably not getting a lot done.
Exactly, exactly. You do not want to be too comfortable.
Yeah, definitely not. So we're talking about great hires. Where do you find these guys? So we're talking about like sourcing hires. Where do you look? How do you find like the top guys?
It is difficult. And looking at how the methodology has been changing over the decades of my career, I don't think anybody really knows. I mean, there are things that people try, there are practices,
Right.
but if somebody tells you he knows exactly how to do it, this person is not telling you the truth. It is difficult,
It's-
and it is statistical,
yeah.
and you cannot be 100% correct. But the most reliable thing is to use your own personal network. You talk to people you know, you ask people you know to refer to you, the people they know. So this is the first thing. Again, if you just limit yourself to that, that's too comfortable and it doesn't scale. So you need to
Hmm.
expand your network. And that's more difficult. You need to start looking for people who are outside of your network. And there are tools like LinkedIn, obviously, there are hiring sites. But then how do you filter? How do you detect who's the good person and who's just, a pretender, right? What I found works the best, at least it used to work for me. Look at the accomplishments,
Hmm.
look at the projects that this person has done, and have this person talk about it. Do you see
Hmm.
passion? Do you see knowledge? Do you see the understanding? Do you see the pride?
Hmm.
I think this is what works for me. If I see the pride, if I see the appreciation of this person's own accomplishments, I think it's a very, very good sign.
Yeah, that's tricky. I mean, it's essentially looking for intangibles, and you know, it's hard to get that down to a science when you're looking for something that we know what it is, pride, but it's really hard to quantify. So
Absolutely,
you would look at
absolutely,
accomplishments,
absolutely. And you know that Google used to give people mind twisters, and it doesn't work
right?
because, well, it does kind of account for some correlation with IQ, and IQ is what you want, but you end up
Hmm.
hiring people who are good at solving mind twisters, and this is not exactly what
Right.
they're supposed to do professionally, at work.
I was just gonna say you can make inferences when you see someone, turn the wheels in their head and try and solve a problem, but it's not gonna translate one to one directly to what you're looking for in a startup.
Correct,
It can just be a good indicator.
correct. It's only one of the indicators, and I've known people
Yeah.
who worked for me and they were insanely great, and they couldn't pass an interview. They
Yeah.
they were just clamped down, and they wouldn't be able to code under several pairs of eyes looking over their shoulder.
Right. Well, that's why you hire through your network, right?
Correct, correct. But
Yeah.
again, it doesn't scale. Unfortunately, it doesn't scale. It's good for a startup. It's not good for your expansion phase.
Well, let's talk about that. So, how quickly can you scale a team when you're also trying to, maintain that startup culture that's so lean and able to tackle different problems and respond quickly to changes? How do you scale that?
Well, it is difficult. I have to make a disclaimer. I've never really gone through a true explosive phase of my startups.
Hmm.
Our growth was more organic. We hired people when we needed them, and we didn't have a lot of money to do this, so we did it on a fairly slow pace. But what I want to say is, if your startup starts generating a lot of revenue, you feel that you need to grow. There is a great temptation to start hiring more people. Uh,
Hmm.
the danger here is not just the culture; it's also productivity.
Hmm.
Small teams, let's say a dozen people, they are much more productive per person than larger teams. They can outperform a team which is 200 people large. So you have to be really, really, really careful about expanding the team.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's arguing with you there. I mean, before Instagram got acquired, it was like 10 guys in a room, right? And sometimes when your organization is too big, you get these kind of checks and balances within the company. People are competing,
Exactly,
and
exactly.
it's hard to pivot and make something when you have a
That's
lot
right.
of
That's
voices in the
right.
room. Yeah.
So I
So
think
that's the challenge.
what's the challenge here is compartmentalizing your technology.
Hmm.
Try to keep islands in your product that are still managed and developed by relatively small teams. Of course, you will have an overhead of cross-team communication, but at least you would maintain the sense of ownership, which I think is very, very important, to maintain the sense of
Mhm.
ownership of what people do, because this keeps their pride in their accomplishments.
So, would you say it's important to hire slowly in those early stages of a startup's life?
Yes, yes, I firmly believe that it is. But at the same time, you should be opportunistic. If you find a good
Mm.
person, hire him or her.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's a great caveat to add. It's terrible to just live by a rule. But of course, if you see someone with the intellect and the people soft skills, go ahead and hire them. How does hiring accelerate for a startup? Because I'm imagining it's early. You're building your team very intentionally, picking each piece very carefully. But at some point, you're going to have to accelerate when it comes to hiring. Can you just tell me what that's like, and maybe some best practices or insights from when you've experienced that?
Well, a rule of thumb is that when you hire a new person, the first period of time, this person is going to be net negative for you.
Hmm.
Well, because there is a ramp, and there is an overhead of you and your people spending time with this person and, helping to find the ropes, so to speak. That's why everybody tries to find an exact fit for the position they're trying to fill, because they're trying to
Right.
minimize this overhead. And this rarely happens. And some people do it better than others. I remember I hired a guy to fill a position of sustaining engineer. That happened in my early days when F5 Networks bought my startup. And we
Hmm.
went through this process of explosive growth of the product footprint in a
Right.
very, very short period of time, because we had the technology and all of a sudden we had a huge sales force, and the product just went out to the masses. And we were just buried under the load of bugs and feature requests. And I hired this guy whom I knew from the Netscape days. And all of a sudden, everything changed.
Hmm.
No, everything became quiet. He just became a
Yeah.
wall that shielded us. So things like that, they do happen. On another hand, you can have a person that you spend, 2, 3 months ramping up. Now, what can help, to ramp up? Well, if you build the technology correctly, it helps. Do not
Hmm.
build a monolithic code base. Try to compartmentalize your product. Now, if you can give this person, a new person, an isolated task, great. Uh, I've been usually trying to find a task that has a very high optionality if it succeeds. But if it fails, it's okay. It's not great, but
Hmm.
it's okay. And this way you can
Hmm.
actually gauge what the person is capable of. And if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. You know, you let this person go.
I still want to ask one more question about the evolution of hiring. Early hires and late hires, you're looking for maybe different things,
Yes,
but what stays
absolutely.
the same? What stays the same when you're looking for an early hire and a late hire? What never changes in the hiring process, and then maybe what does?
Well, ideally, as I already mentioned, you want to hire
Hmm.
top people because they will be more productive, and per output they will cost you less, even when you pay them more. Uh, I think the best document that I read about this is the HR document from Netflix. It's
Hmm.
the people who wrote this document, they're much more articulate than I am. It's a great, great
Hmm.
document. I highly, highly recommend to read it. This is their stick. They're trying to hire the best people. They pay them top dollar. They overpay them, and they retain them until they remain top people. Until they produce. And they apply this methodology even while being, multi-billion dollar, big company.
So is that HR on Netflix?
I do not remember exactly what's the name of this document, but if you Google HR methodology of Netflix, I'm sure you'll find it. I found this document to be very, very insightful, and it really corresponds to my own thoughts on the subject.
Okay. Well, and if you can't find it, we can look into it afterwards and make sure it's in the show notes for you guys listening. Next, I want to talk about stages in hiring. Can you tell me the difference between early stages when you're looking for doers and then later when you're looking for repetitors? And what are those?
Well, I would call it slightly differently. I call them starters and finishers.
Oh,
The
okay.
early stage is incredibly obviously important because you start a company. Let's say you start a company, you have a co-founder or two co-founders. Nobody is well-rounded. Nobody has
Hmm.
a perfect set of skills. Even if you
Hmm.
have sort of on paper a good combination of responsibilities in the executive team and the management team, you're still not very well-rounded. So, and
Hmm.
there is this saying that you do not work on your weaknesses. You work on your strengths. Now, working on your weaknesses doesn't really pay. What you do with your weaknesses, you complement them by the people that you hire. And initially, when you're still building the team, this is the key. You find people who complement you, who are smarter in certain areas than you are. People who can surprise you, people who will deliver more than you ask them to. And those
Yeah.
are the starters. Now, finishers, well, usually when you grow, when the technology matures, there are a lot of things that just need to be done. Bugs to fix, features to implement, and you can have people who are maybe less creative. I think
Mm,
creative is the word, but you still want to
got it.
have diligent, responsible, productive people.
People that get the work done.
Yes.
Yeah, that makes sense. My mind goes straight to my swimming days thinking about a relay race. You'd have four guys, you would have the starter, and it's really important for the starter to be able to jump off the block as faster than everybody and get you started basically on a good footing. So you want someone that, can consistently do that. And then the finishers, those are the most competitive guys. They're the ones that got to get to the wall first. So they really need to be able to, look at what's going on and sort of complete the task.
Right, right. And by the way, sometimes the starters they leave the company before it becomes big and basically a well-oiled machine.
Hmm.
Then they don't necessarily stay, and that's okay as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so as a startup, how would you compete with big corporations like Google and Facebook for talent when they have, all the resources in the world?
Well, the short answer, you don't. You can't.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, you can't. Hiring these days in the Silicon Valley is very, very difficult. So, people look for the talent elsewhere. And,
Hmm.
it's been a norm in the industry to go overseas, to look for
Hmm.
people in India, China, Eastern Europe, basically everywhere, anywhere. And a tempting thought is that people do it to save money because on average it's been for a long time it's been that a fully loaded cost of a person overseas is one third what you pay here in the Silicon Valley. But if you remember what I said about people's productivity being different up to
Hmm.
20 to 1, 3 to 1
Hmm.
is not a big number compared to 20 to 1. So you may save on money and you can lose on talent. So when you go to get that talent overseas, it's really the talent that should be the focus.
Hmm.
And you still want to pay the top dollar for that locality if you can find a good person.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think you're saying be don't be cheap on your engineers, but there is an opportunity to hire overseas. Maybe not the top guys, but sort of the guys that are
Top guys locally,
slightly
that's
less
what you
good.
go after. You do hire top guys locally. And I have to say that the quality of the talent overseas, it has grown tremendously since the
Yeah.
days that when I had the office in Siberia. I had a relatively recent experience with people in the city of Ulyanovsk, and they're very well educated, very up to date, and they know everything. So
Hmm.
great talent.
Yeah. how do you do that if you're, maybe from the Silicon Valley and you've never been to Europe?
I think it's
You know?
hard. I think you need to find somebody who has been, or maybe somebody who has local connections. And the critical hire is the person who will run this office, because
Yeah.
this person will do the local hiring, this person will do all of the administrative trivia, and do not discount that as well. You know,
Hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. So people say hire great people. That's kind of a platitude that goes
it
around.
is.
But how do you make that process actionable and quantifiable? Because hire great people sounds great and it's easy to remember, but how do we sort of bring some science and methodology into this?
As I already alluded to, I don't think that we're at a point where there is a science and methodology.
Right.
I just don't believe in it. I think the best we could have done, we could have administered an IQ test, a real
Hmm.
one, not what people do on the internet where they ask you 20 questions. No, a real one takes actually 2 days, but it's not legal.
Hmm.
It is illegal in the United States to hire on the basis of an IQ test. So people do all kinds of proxies to it.
Hmm.
And here you get your mind twisters or coding exercises.
Right. That we've already mentioned the
Yes,
the
yes,
mind
yes,
twisters from
yes, yes.
Google.
So I think in a way the science here is intentionally, suspended, and maybe it's a good thing. Who knows?
Yeah. Do you think so? Overseas, are there limitations, or can you actually hire using an IQ test in other countries? Because if you're hiring
Huh.
overseas, what are the rules there?
You've just surprised me. I haven't thought of that.
All right, I guess we all have a little bit of homework for after this.
Thank you. That's a good point. That's a very good point.
I
Yeah.
love to walk away from my meetings with something to do.
But
So
that
great.
said, IQ is the best predictor of individual success, but it's a lousy predictor in of itself. It does have a correlation with success. It's relatively weak, so you need to augment it with more stuff. But I don't know how do you figure out that the person is responsible, other than looking at the past?
Other than watching them work,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, that's the
People have
challenge.
tried. People have tried. Hiring on a trial basis. I really dislike this idea because i- if you do this, you start from a point of distrust,
Yeah,
and that's
that's true.
and the beginning of the professional relationship is very, very important. And besides, I mean, we in California, it's a you can hire anybody, you can fire anybody.
Hmm.
It's a hire at
Yeah,
will state.
that's yeah. So hiring is this big problem, but when you're starting a startup, you obviously have other responsibilities and a lot of work to do. So how much time do you spend on your regular, growing the business activities versus hiring? How big of a commitment should you make to that?
I think it's very situational. I mean, there's been time in my startups when I spent absolutely zero time on hiring. We were just all heads down, you know, nose to the
Mhm.
grind and thinking about nothing else. And there were periods of time when I needed people, and that could take up to 50% of my time.
Mm. Okay. So I guess it's variable. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, you got to read the room, understand. You got to have your goal in mind, and hiring is gonna, how much time you need to spend on hiring is gonna change based on
Of
that.
course. Now, when you're a big
Um,
company, that's a very different thing.
well, you can hire a department to do it
And
full
that's what
time.
people do, yes.
Yeah. What are some of the crucial areas you should assess potential candidates? I mean, I know we already said IQ and you started talking about maybe some like pride. Are they proud when they talk about their work? Are there any other areas you can look to besides IQ and accomplishments, or have we already kind of covered that?
We kind of covered that. Conscientiousness, the ability to hit deadlines, the ability to work hard, basically the stay in power.
Yeah, I think it's important. I'm just going to reiterate your point of using your network. Like you get the best insights by just talking to people most of the time, and people are pretty good judges of character.
Yes,
In general.
and when you hire outside of your network, or the close network, then you really need to chase down the references. and not only in the reference that a candidate provides, but find your own. Just case in
Right.
point, uh, my boss in my previous gig spent about 4 months, to hire me. Long time, long time. I've almost given
Yeah.
up on that. So he talked to just about anyone at Cisco that he knew, who knew me.
Mm. He did his due
He did
diligence.
a lot of due diligence, yes, a lot.
And how'd that work out?
Well, we worked together for 9 years. I think it was a very
Yeah.
good professional relationship, and we still, in a sense, work together because he's a chairman of the board of the startup that I'm now with, that I'm a co-founder of.
Cool. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about that, just quickly?
Yes, what we're trying to do in this startup, it's called Zytra. We're trying to reinvent the very old traditional profession of mortgage broker with artificial intelligence. I'm sure you've seen a lot of articles that would list the occupations that are going to get killed by artificial intelligence. It's usually
Right. I read, what is it? Need not apply. That's like almost 10 years old now, maybe.
right. And
Humans need not
yes,
apply.
yes, yes.
That's,
What's interesting, this profession of mortgage broker, it's never on that list, so it's not obvious at
mm,
all. That's why I like this idea, and I think it's also very, very long overdue because it's an old profession. It hasn't really been fully automated, and it's very, very lucrative.
all right. Well, I'm going to stop you there. I don't want to give away any more secrets because this is still not
Sure,
fleshed out.
sure.
Okay. Now let's go back. I have a couple more questions on hiring. When you're talking to people, they're in an interview, they're presenting their best self. They're bringing their resume with all of their accomplishments, and they're sort of prepped to talk about those things. How do you get beyond the answers that they give you and to the actual truths behind those answers when you're interviewing someone? So this is like interview strategy, I guess.
It's a good question. Well, you sort of cross correlate the answers, but it is difficult. I mean, I can offhandedly give you a dozen examples of people who really shined during the interview and didn't really deliver when you hired them. It is difficult. It is very, very difficult. Those are different skills.
For sure.
Being good at an interview is a skill.
It is. It is. One that I wish I spent more time on. But I'm doing okay. So we talked about hiring people. Let's talk about retaining people. What are some strategies you have for retaining your top performers? Because of course they're going to be sought after because they're the top guys. So what can you do to keep your best people around?
Well, I would say that loyalty can be either bought or inspired, and it's better to have both to some extent. So,
Hmm.
monetarily, you want your people to be comfortable, not necessarily overpaid, but comfortable, because every time you give somebody a raise, the jolt of this event, it dissipates within a month.
Hmm.
Like people forget about it.
Yeah,
They really want to be comfortable financially, and that's good enough.
people
But
forget too quickly.
it's normal. It's normal. That's how most of us operate. But there is
Yeah.
another side, which is you want them to be inspired.
Hmm.
I think managing engineers is sort of kind of easy. Well, in the same way as playing the stock market is easy. You buy low, you sell high. I mean, it's easy to say, it's
Uh-huh.
not easy to do. You want to keep people
It's simple. It might not be easy.
right. You want to keep engineers challenged. That's the key. The best thing is when you ask somebody to do impossible. That's the best thing that
Mm.
happened to me as a manager. I'm happy that it happened to me quite a few times. You ask people to do impossible. You yourself, you have no clue how to do it. And first thing you hear from people, you stupid. You have no idea. You're asking for something impossible. And then 2 weeks
Right.
later, they would come to you and say, "Hey, you stupid. I figured it all out." And that's just beautiful when it happens.
Yeah.
So I think a happy engineer is a busy engineer.
Okay. Do you treat this is kind of off the cuff, but do you would you treat other departments like you would engineers, or is that specific to engineering teams?
I think it's mostly specific to engineering teams.
Okay.
And it's hard to me to say because, as a manager, I ran engineering. Always I ran engineering. And I've never been a CEO of a company.
So that's your experience. That
Yeah,
makes sense.
that's my spiel.
Um, so we're talking about building teams, and at a certain point, your startup it needs to grow. How do you scale yourself as a founder when your company has grown to a certain stage and you
Mhm.
can see it's still got growing to do?
Well, I like to quote Napoleon from time to time, the Napoleon Bonaparte.
Okay.
And reportedly, he said once that nobody should have more than 7 direct reports. So there is this
Hmm.
mechanical aspect of it. You should not have too many direct reports. Otherwise, your attention is going to be, uh, you know, uh, everywhere, and you'll lose it effectively. So and you delegate in order to keep your own bandwidth reasonable, right?
Interesting.
So that's one side, and another side is the competency side, the well-rounded side that I mentioned. That nobody is good at everything.
Hmm.
So you should first of all complement yourself. Complement
Which means
yourself with
addressing your weaknesses.
yes, address your weaknesses. Hire people who can complement your weaknesses.
Yeah. At what point do you know it's time to start doing that? What point do you let go as a founder?
Well, I would say when your engineering team is, again, I'm an engineer, is above 20 people, like, it's certainly time. It
Yeah.
is certainly time.
Hmm. I guess imagine you're a founder and your startup has grown and it's maybe been 5 years and you've reached, you're still around, which is a big deal for a startup. How do you how do you admit to yourself that maybe there are areas you're not so strong in, and how do you go about hiring people that might be better than you at your own job?
Well, I would say that in this situation, your boss or the board will probably tell you.
Yeah.
That's point number one.
Hmm.
And for yourself, again, you have to be very cognizant that everybody has weaknesses. It's very,
Hmm.
very important to understand what you're not good at. For example, I'm
Hmm.
very, very good at managing internal teams. I'm decent, but I'm not the best when it comes, to the outside relationships for the company. I have to force myself. This doesn't come to me naturally. So, if I have somebody who does it better, I'll gladly, offload this to this person.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's important to always analyze self, and a lot of times we don't do that enough.
I've known people who were just very, very stubborn in realizing that, and I think they could have been a lot more successful. Understanding that, a person that I have in mind, I'm not gonna, tell the name, but he's a great CTO. She's a great idea engineer, but he's not a CEO,
Hmm.
and he should have, given up on that part a long time ago.
Do you think there are any indicators, taking it back to hiring? Do you think there's any indicators of people that might be good at hearing advice and doing retrospective thinking, or is that something that you can't tell off the bat?
It's hard to say, really hard to say.
Yeah, I was just I'm here to ask the hard questions, so let's just keep moving on. We'll talk about localized and remote talent. So you mentioned you ran an engineering team. Where again? In
Well,
Europe?
I had several experiences. So I've created one team in Siberia, in the city of Tomsk.
Hmm.
Then I had a remote team in India. I had remote teams when I was at Cisco in several locations in Massachusetts and Colorado, here in San Jose, and we started developing a team in India. And recently I had a team in the city of Ulyanovsk in Russia.
Okay, so you have like a wealth of experience, and you've also run internal teams, I imagine,
Of course,
local
of
teams.
course, of course.
So can you tell me about like some of the pros and the cons of a local versus a remote team?
Sure, absolutely. Well, let me tell you the first sort of fundamental truth. Nothing beats a co-located team if you can afford it. Like
Hmm.
nothing beats a co-located team. Nothing can substitute for just a brief chat at a water cooler, because
Yeah.
those spontaneous interactions between people are great. And you just
Hmm.
you heard a remark, you reply to it, and you grab a guy and you go into a conference room and you start whiteboarding. Now, those are precious
Yep.
moments. Nothing can substitute them. No kind of tool or scheduled meeting. But
Hmm.
the caveat is if you can afford it. If you cannot afford it, cost. Yes, unfortunately, cost always comes into play.
Hmm.
Well, so with remote teams, the cost savings are there. They're just not as large as simple bean counting would tell you. And there is always an overhead.
Hmm.
You as a manager, you if you have a remote team, you start burning the candle on both sides. Typical uh, day routine is you wake up, you open the lid of the computer, you start typing, right? You start to talking to
Yeah.
people because there is a time difference. In the evening, you stop talking to people, you close the lid, and you crash. It's
Hmm.
unsustainable. It's difficult.
Yeah. I'm frowning just thinking about it. I mean, this is the world we're kind of living in today because of coronavirus,
That's
but
right.
it's definitely not
That's right.
ideal.
That's right. So time difference is difficult to overcome. There are also
Hmm.
cultural aspects. Uh,
Of course.
when I had an Indian team, that was quite a bit of a struggle initially. It came literally to a point when I had another Indian local member of the team who served not exactly as a translator, but as a reinforcer of my points. So
Yeah.
I would say something, he would repeat the same stuff, and then he would look them in the eye and he would say, "Did you really understand that?" Because I was saying things that were counter to the culture. I was telling them, guys, you need to challenge me. Don't say yes.
Hmm.
I know you disagree. Challenge me. Let's argue. Let's decide what's the best. And culturally, it was very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, culture stands in the way of communication for sure. It's a thing that culture makes communication easier when you share culture, but it does present challenges when you have opposing cultures, and I can see that happening.
Well, I'm Russian, so my team in Ulyanovsk,
Hard to understand already.
even with that team, I've been out of the country for almost 30 years, and they're younger generation, so
Hmm.
they were kind of issues that were difficult to overcome.
Yeah, how do you communicate? Like, what are the best tools? I mean, we got Slack today. Do you have any tips on Slack, or when it comes to communicating online? What are your insights? What have you learned to be true about that?
Well,
What's the best way to do
20 years ago, I used ICQ for the same, stuff that people use Slack for.
that? Hmm.
Slack, well, I honestly, I'm not a big fan.
Hmm.
I just don't like, the concept of channels in Slack. I think they proliferate like crazy. They create too much noise. But as a chat, as a multi-point chat, I think it's fantastic. And the integration with other tools is also very, very good. But channels, I'm not a big fan of channels.
I've felt it too. You start a channel for something that's very important. It's easy to put a SWAT team together that works on something very quickly. But sooner than later, you're just going to have more and more channels. You might
That's
have
right.
one
That's right. And I
for sharing music and podcasts, which is maybe not so useful, or maybe it is, and that's tricky. So, did you ever compartmentalize like communications? Did you ever like spend an hour a day just for emails, or are you sort of always going, always ready to get pinged? Because it's actually really annoying to me when I get a ping and I'm working on something that needs to be responded to.
Well, sometimes I do compartmentalize. Sometimes I do. But again, it's contextual. Sometimes you cannot because you're waiting for something.
Yeah, you got to figure it
Yeah.
out. Okay. So let's get back to startups. I want to know what kind of activities you can outsource. I mean, we've said there's cost savings
Mhm.
potential when it comes to engineering. But what are the things you cannot outsource? What do you have to keep in house?
Your core competency. You need to decide from early on what is the core competency of the company, what the company is about. Everything else can, and a big portion of that should be outsourced. And some of those things are easy, and people have been doing it for now 25 years. You outsource HR, you
Mm-hmm.
outsource, payroll, you outsource 401k and all of those things. You even outsource a lot of engineering stuff. And in this day and age, it's actually great because there are a bunch of cloud services that you can buy and they're cheap and do not invent the wheel. But your
Mm-hmm.
core competency should stay in the company. Never ever outsource that.
Hmm. How do you go about defining your core competency? I mean, I imagine as a founder, you have a really good idea for what it is, but
It's your
writing it
elevator
down,
pitch. It's your elevator pitch. It's your competitive advantage. Why would
yeah.
you outsource your
Okay,
competitive advantage?
good answer. Yeah, that totally makes sense. Um, how do you go about establishing operating processes in startups?
That's a good question, and one that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. First of all, everybody has processes. Every startup has a process, even if they don't think about it as a process. Uh, each size of the company has its own sort of sweet spot for a process. Large company
Mhm,
necessitates having a complicated operational process because that's how they work, and that's how they communicate. You know how people in big companies communicate. In a smaller company, you want them to be lightweight as possible, because they should not distract you from your core stuff. Uh,
mhm,
so I view processes almost as code. You design them, you debug them, you evolve them, and keep them lightweight. I mean, there is this spirit of agile that is captured by the original Agile Manifesto, which I'm a big fan of. Keep your processes in that spirit, not necessarily formally, as one of the commonly used agile practices, but keep the spirit.
mhm. I think that's really interesting. I think I got one more question, and then we'll wrap it up. So, how should you go about hiring? I think you come from a technical background, but if you were to come from a non-technical background, how would you go about hiring when it comes to technical positions such as engineering? How do you hire when it's outside of your domain, kind of?
Well, I don't think I have a first-hand experience other than talking to people who had that problem.
Hmm.
So you're talking about a founder who is a business person and he tried to do engineering and it doesn't quite work. And he doesn't know what
Hmm.
to do. Yes, I've seen that happen. I think you need to find a key person that complements your deficiency. Find a technical co-founder. That'll solve the problem.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay.
And understand this early on.
Yeah. Interesting. I think we have a lot of maybe not repeating ideas, but really strong ideas in this interview. Do you have any more takeaways, like key takeaways, when it comes to recruiting top guys, or should we just end it here?
Well, I just want to reiterate that what you should be doing, you should be finding the best guys and paying them well.
Yeah.
And one great guy is better than 10 mediocre ones.
Okay. I think those are strong words to end on. Before we go, Igor, what's the best way for our listeners to reach and find you?
I'm on LinkedIn as Igor Plotnikov. That's the best way.
Okay. Okay. Well, now you know where to find him. Thanks for listening, guys. We're going to end it there. If you have any questions, please send us an email at info@angelnears.com. Thanks, Igor, for joining the show. And let's have you back on here soon.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.